Who's the greatest? Of the disciples, who would be the greatest? Who would be the one on top of the mountain? Would it be one of the three that Jesus called to the Mount of Transfiguration? James, John, Peter? I wonder if the apostles even knew what greatness is. I wonder if we know what greatness is. I'd like to retell a story. It's a real-life story, and it happened about 12 years ago. You probably have heard of it, but I think it's worth repeating. It's a story about true greatness. It's about Dan Mazur. I think I'm saying his last name correctly. If not, that's what I'm going to say because that's how I know it. Dan Mazur was a professional mountain climber. And early one morning in May, back in 2006, he was leading two well-paying clients up the ascent to Mount Everest. They were only 2 hours away from the summit. They were so close. They were up over 28,000 feet and just 835 feet to go. But as they approached the summit, they saw off in the distance a dot of color, wondering what it could be. As they got closer to it, they discovered it wasn't a tent or anything else, but it was another climber. His name was Lincoln Hall. He had made it to the top, but upon the descent, he became gravely ill through lack of oxygen. His two Sherpa guides tried to help him, but because of the conditions and that night was coming on, they were pretty sure he was dead. And so they abandoned him and they went down to the nearest camp. But it turns out that Hall wasn't dead. That somehow he had managed to survive that night without gloves, very little oxygen or food, or even a sleeping bag. He had perched himself on this little ridge, which is about the size of this ambo. 8,000 feet down over there and 6,000 feet over here. How he survived, nobody knows. But that's what Dan Mazur and his guides, and the people he was guiding, rather, found. And so they did all that they could. They gave him food, they gave him their coats, they gave him everything to survive. But what they had to do, I need to go back to my story. And as they were struggling to help him survive, two other climbers came up. They said, "Well, can you help us?" They said, No, we don't speak English." And they continued up towards the summit. And what's really sad about that, about 11 days earlier, there was a man named David Sharp who had died. And before he even died, there was people that were on their way to the ascent, leaving him behind, not willing to give up their ascent in order to care for him. But anyway, a long story short, they were able to get hauled down the mountain. He was able to survive. And then being asked about it, this is what Dave Mazur said, that he had no regrets at all. He said, "You know what? You can always go back to the summit, but you have one life to live. If I had left that man to die, that would have been on my mind for the rest of my life. How could I live like that?" So back to the question. Who was the greatest on the mountain? Was it the two people that didn't speak English, apparently, that made it to the summit? Or was it the others that made it to the summit walking by David Sharp? Or was it Dan Mazur and his team that spent a great deal of money, time, energy, who found that they were only 835 feet from the summit? But it turns out that all their time, money, and effort wasn't wasted. That they had conquered Everest without reaching the top of the peak. Mazur knew what greatness was. He and his team had put aside their own dreams of conquering Everest for the sake of saving a fellow climber. Now put that in the question of the apostles. Who would be the greatest? Who would make it to the top? The apostles, and oftentimes us, even though we're all called to greatness, we really don't know what greatness is, or we choose to forget what true greatness is. Jesus is teaching them that today. He said greatness isn't necessarily making it to the summit, but perhaps the road to greatness is a descent. It's getting on our hands and knees to serve the person in need. Jesus would show them what greatness is, that it always exists in the form of the cross. As the apostles in today's gospel and for us today, we're called to follow Christ. We're called to greatness. But in order to do so, are we willing to achieve that by setting aside our own desires for the sake of others? The call of Jesus to greatness means the road of humbleness, of humble generosity, and the willingness to rank first among our families, our friends, and communities, letting that go by taking on the role of a servant. Remember what Jesus says. If anyone wishes to be first, he shall be the last of all and servant of all. Isn't that what we heard in that first reading? Where we can see the jealousy and the selfish ambition that's so prevalent in our world, that they gang up to attack the just man. In the book of James, or the Apostle James is berating those folks that are godless, that have rejected God and the Son, and are all about themselves and their own personal ambition. And so, in other words, the sign of a true Christian is always seen in letting the other's needs, the needs of the common. Sometimes it has to be in front of ourselves. We're called to do this continually, to make those sacrifices in order to serve Christ, in order to serve the other. And in doing so, we find that there's something within us that is touched as well, that our greatest needs, in touching the needs of the other and reaching Christ, that somehow we touch that in ourselves and that is nurtured within us. But I think the biggest problem for you and for me is conquering that Everest inside ourselves. And that Everest might be our own selfish pride. It might be about making our lives about ourselves. It's getting down the road to descent, not necessarily climbing that road to whatever our world may call us glory and fame, but it means service. The mission that we've been given as Christians and as a church is to do that, to be the hands, the feet of Christ to one another, to be willing to give ourselves. Are we willing to continue to do so if we aren't already? And if we are already doing that, and especially in the way of working within the church to helping others to come and to love Jesus, perhaps it's being a catechist. Perhaps it's reaching out into those in need in our community by serving at St. Vincent's. Perhaps, like I know some of you here are doing, are bringing those that cannot come to church on their own. They're here today because of your willingness to serve. Those of you that are bringing communion and praying with those that are homebound. What a wonderful gift of extending this celebration in God's love to those in need. Those are but a few examples. But we need to continue to be stretching ourselves to do so in our parish and in our world. Our goal is to live as Christ. Our goal is to be that greatness that comes in service, that greatness that comes in love, that comes in the shape of a cross. Jesus made himself weak so that we could be strong. So we pray today for this strength, the strength that allows us to reach out to others in service and in love.